Paris, January 1919. Scarcely 2 months after the armistice silenced the Western Front on November 11, 1918. The First World War has ended, but Europe has not yet learned how to be alive again. The Seine moves like dull metal under a winter sky, and the city wears victory the way a tired man wears a borrowed coat. Hotels are full of delegates and aides and clerks who have not slept properly in years. Maps are unrolled on tables as if they were surgical drapes. In the corridors, the war still speaks, not in gunfire now, but in numbers. Ships sunk, villages erased, coal tonnage, railway miles, the count of widows, the count of graves. It was not merely a war of armies. It was a war of whole societies, the first on this scale to be fought with the full muscle of industry and the full reach of the globe. Factories became arsenals. Railways became arteries of slaughter. Blockades starved cities that never saw a trench. Men were fed into artillery and machine guns as if nations had discovered a new way to spend human beings. When the firing stopped, the spell did not break. Millions of soldiers are still in motion, demobilizing, limping home, carrying influenza and rage and silence. Paper money multiplies while goods vanish. Credit is thin. Governments have learned to command, requisition, censor, and promise. Now they must learn to stop, and no one is sure they can. The old scaffolding of Europe has cracked under the strain. Russia has collapsed into revolution and civil war. Austria-Hungary has shattered into new names and hurried borders. The Ottoman world is being carved into mandates and claims. Germany, suddenly without a Kaiser, stands defeated and hungry, its ports choked by the aftermath of blockade, its politics feverish, its streets full of returned soldiers asking who betrayed them and what defeat will cost. Across the continent, new states appear on maps like fresh stitches, and each stitch pulls at someone else's skin. The peacemakers arrive carrying different wounds, and therefore different definitions of safety. France has survived on ground that looks flayed, its northeast blasted, its families thinned, its imagination haunted by 2 invasions in half a lifetime. Britain wants Europe to function again because trade is a kind of oxygen and empires suffocate when markets close. America arrives speaking a new language full of leagues, self-determination, and open diplomacy, and yet it carries an old problem in its pocket, a home politics that can refuse any promise made abroad. So the conference becomes a workshop where men try to build a future out of paper. Borders are drawn for provinces most of the drawers have never walked. New states plead for ports and rail lines and coal fields. Old states bargain to keep what they can. Each clause is a compromise between fear and fatigue. Each signature is expected to do the work of armies. And yet the paradox sits on the table from the start. The peace must be hard enough to reassure the victors, especially France, and also workable enough to let Europe breathe again. It must restrain Germany and also reintegrate Germany, because a continent cannot be rebuilt while its largest industrial nation is kept permanently on its knees. Can a treaty be both a lock and a bridge? Can a defeated nation be built without being broken? Can borders be redrawn without planting future wars inside them? And what happens when the very nations writing the peace cannot agree on what peace is supposed to mean? In a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne, in the early hours of November 11th, 1918, the war ended with a signature that felt less like reconciliation than like exhaustion. Outside the carriage, the trees stood black and indifferent. Inside, uniforms and paperwork did what artillery could not. They decided what would happen next. Germany's representatives had come through lines and blockades to beg for a stopping of the blood, and they arrived to find that the stopping came with conditions that were already a kind of victory in miniature. The German army would withdraw. Weapons would be surrendered. Rail stock would be handed over. The blockade would continue, not as a weapon of war now, but as leverage for the peace to come. For the men in Berlin and the soldiers in the trenches, this mattered. The war had ended without an enemy army marching through the Brandenburg Gate. The front had not collapsed into a rout on German soil. The Kaiser fled, the flags changed, the rhetoric of a new republic rose quickly, but the geography of defeat was strangely abstract. A nation can accept loss more easily when it sees the conqueror's boots. It can also invent excuses more easily when it does not. The armistice, meant to be a pause while peace was written, became in German memory a doorway through which suspicion would later crawl. If the war ended by agreement, why would the peace look like punishment? If a new democratic government had replaced the old, why should the new be treated as if it had planned the old war? These were not questions asked in good faith by everyone, but they were questions that could live in a hungry country. On the Allied side, the same carriage in the same forest produced a different lesson. If Germany was still intact, still industrial, still densely populated, then France's fear did not die with the armistice. It sharpened. France had watched its frontier turn into a slaughterhouse in 1914, and then it watched the slaughter continue for 4 years. It had survived, but survival had come at a price that felt like national mutilation. Villages were erased, coal mines flooded, factories blown apart, cemeteries laid down like new suburbs. A treaty that offered France only noble language and distant promises would be a treaty written against French reality. So the armistice was not an end, but a holding position. The generals went back to their capitals and the politicians came forward, yet the logic remained military. Keep pressure, hold the advantage, shape the terms while the enemy is weak. That is how wars are usually concluded. The novelty lay in the scale of the expectations now poured into the conclusion. It was not enough to stop the fighting. The peace was expected to prevent a repetition, repair the damage, pay the debts, satisfy the dead, and inaugurate a new kind of world politics. It was asked to do what no document had ever done, to pull modern mass society back from the edge while leaving the machinery of modern power intact. When Woodrow Wilson crossed the Atlantic in December 1918, the ship's wake seemed, for a moment, like the wake of a new era. No American president had ever traveled to Europe while in office. The gesture alone carried a kind of prophecy, and Europe, tired of its own dynasties and exhausted by its own cynicism, was ready to believe. Crowds gathered in ports and streets. Newspapers printed portraits like icons. The language of the 14 points, offered earlier in the war, had already worked its way into imaginations. Open covenants, freedom of the seas, reduction of armaments, a league of nations, a peace without annexations, a world in which peoples would not be traded like parcels. Wilson himself brought a moral confidence that was almost frightening in its simplicity. He believed that the war had happened because the old system of secret diplomacy and balance of power had failed. Replace that system with transparent agreements and collective security, and the disease would lose its host. Yet he arrived in a Europe that did not feel diseased by accident. It felt injured by experience. The men waiting for him in Paris were not abstract thinkers. They were survivors of invasions, guardians of empires, managers of restless electorates, and borrowers staring at mountains of debt. Georges Clemenceau, the French Prime Minister, did not need to imagine German power. He had lived under it as a young man after 1870, and he had watched it return in 1914. He wanted physical guarantees, limits on German armaments, a demilitarized zone, perhaps a separation of the Rhineland from Germany's control, anything that would put distance and time between France and the next German army. David Lloyd George, in Britain, had won an election in the shadow of victory with promises that suggested Germany would be made to pay. Yet Britain's deeper interest was stability and commerce. Britain needed a Germany that could trade and a Europe that could buy. It also needed to keep France from becoming the unchallenged master of the continent. Italy came with its own bitterness, claiming lands promised during the war, wanting recognition as a great power, and leaving Paris feeling cheated. Japan watched the proceedings with the quiet patience of a nation that had gained from the war and intended to gain more. In the first weeks of the conference, the gap between languages became the true battlefield. Wilson spoke the language of principles. Clemenceau spoke the language of frontiers. Lloyd George spoke the language of voters and ships. Each language carried a different kind of legitimacy. Principles could be beautiful and still fail. Frontiers could be safe and still provoke. Votes could be won and still poison policy. Ships could rule oceans and still not stabilize continents. The conference established committees, commissions, subcommissions, each one a small machine meant to turn chaos into clauses. The world arrived in fragments. Delegates from small nations pushed their claims forward with maps, petitions, and histories. Poles spoke of partitions and resurrection. Czechs spoke of self-rule and security. Romanians spoke of unity. Greeks spoke of ancient rights and modern ports. Arabs spoke of promises made in wartime and hopes for independence. Zionists spoke of a national home. Armenians spoke of survival and slaughter. Each claim was sincere to those making it, and each collided with someone else's sincerity. In the midst of this, the men at the top narrowed their attention to what they believed was the central question: Germany. If Germany could be managed, Europe might be managed. If Germany could not, nothing else would matter for long. Clemenceau traveled through the devastated regions of France as the conference unfolded, and the landscape itself argued for him. In towns where stone churches had been smashed into gray powder, in fields cratered like diseased skin, in forests shredded into splintered stumps, the war had not ended. It had simply stopped moving. The ruins sat in place like evidence in a trial. French officials pointed to collapsed coal pits and ruined factories, to farms that could not plant, to rail lines that could not carry. Reparations were not an abstract demand here. They were a plan for reconstruction, a demand that the hand that broke the house pay to rebuild it. Yet the same landscape also sharpened the French insistence on security. Repairing villages would mean nothing if the villages would be destroyed again. Clemenceau's critics at home did not speak gently. France had endured the war because it believed survival required it. Now the nation expected the peace to repay that endurance with safety. Safety meant that Germany's future strength would be constrained in ways that could be measured, enforced, and believed. The British delegation, watching France's demands, understood the fear and also feared the consequences. If France obtained permanent control over the Rhineland or the coal-rich Saar, France might become too powerful. If Germany was pushed into humiliation, German politics might become explosive. Britain's treasury officials and businessmen worried about trade and credit. Europe's economy was a web. Tear one strand and the vibration travels. A Germany stripped beyond recovery would mean fewer buyers for British goods, less ability to pay for imports, and a general sickness that could infect all currencies. Britain also knew something else, older than 1914. A peace that makes one great power feel it has no future becomes a peace that must be enforced forever. Wilson's advisers warned him in similar terms. Some of them were economists, and they looked at the numbers and saw that the victors were imagining a flow of money that could not flow. Others were political observers. and they looked at the mood in Germany and saw fertile ground for resentment. Yet Wilson remained convinced that institutions could tame passions. If Germany was brought into a league, if disputes were arbitrated, if arms were reduced, the old cycle might be broken. The bargain that emerged between these positions was not a resolution, but a patchwork. France would accept a League of Nations and a demilitarized Rhineland instead of an outright separation. In return, Britain and the United States would provide France a security guarantee if Germany attacked again. The promise sounded sturdy in Paris. It sounded plausible in London. In Washington, it would soon become a political trap. By March 1919, the conference rooms in Paris had begun to smell of paper and impatience. The Council of Four, the small circle of Wilson, Clemenceau, Lloyd George, and Italy's Vittorio Orlando met repeatedly behind closed doors. Arguments were fierce, sometimes personal. Wilson resisted what he saw as old European appetite. Clemenceau resisted what he saw as American innocence. Lloyd George moved between them, bargaining, warning, soothing, and at times inflaming, always aware that a leader who returned home with too gentle a peace might be destroyed by his own supporters. The treaty's most famous elements were not forged in a single dramatic moment, but in an accumulation of decisions made under pressure. Germany's army would be limited, conscription would be forbidden, heavy weapons would be restricted, the navy would be reduced, the Rhineland would be occupied temporarily by Allied troops and kept free of German forces afterward. Germany's colonies would be taken and distributed as mandates, cloaked in the language of trusteeship, but understood by everyone as imperial rearrangement. Reparations became the central poison of argument, because reparations were where grief met arithmetic. The French wanted a number that matched the visible destruction and the invisible loss. The British wanted Germany to pay enough to satisfy public demand, but not so much that the continent's economy collapsed. The Americans wanted a settlement that would not plant the seeds of revenge. In the end, the treaty asserted the principle that Germany and its allies were responsible for the damage and would pay, but it postponed the final sum, leaving it to a reparations commission to determine later. This was meant to preserve flexibility. It also meant that Germany signed without knowing what it owed, and the victors promised their voters payment without knowing what they would receive. There was another clause that would outlive its legal purpose and become a weapon of emotion. The treaty included a statement assigning responsibility to Germany and its allies for causing the war, a piece of language used to establish the legal foundation for reparations. In law, it functioned as a hinge for liability. In politics, it would be heard as a verdict on national honor. Nations can endure debt. They endure humiliation less easily, and they endure it least easily when it is written in black ink and read aloud to hungry crowds. At the same time, the conference attempted to redraw Eastern and Central Europe according to a principle that sounded simple and proved treacherous: self-determination. The old empires had mixed peoples together in tangled patterns. Cities contained one language in the marketplace, another in the schools, another in the churches. Villages shifted dialects across a few miles. Rail lines and rivers did not respect ethnic borders. The peacemakers wanted to create states that would be stable and legitimate, but they also wanted those states to serve strategic purposes, to block Germany's eastern influence, to contain Bolshevik Russia, to reward allies, to punish enemies. So Poland was revived, but its borders could not avoid including minorities, and its corridor to the sea cut across German territory in a way that Germans would remember. Czechoslovakia was created with an industrial spine in Bohemia that included a large German-speaking population in the Sudetenland. Yugoslavia was stitched together from South Slavs with different histories and competing ambitions. Romania expanded. Hungary shrank dramatically, leaving millions of ethnic Hungarians outside the new borders, nursing grievance. These were not minor technicalities, they were the creation of new political weather systems. In Paris, these decisions were often made with maps and reports, not with deep knowledge of local realities. The delegates who most passionately cared about a region tended to be those who came from it, and they naturally advocated for maximum advantage. The great powers, trying to manage the whole, often used the smaller claims as pieces in a larger game. A border was drawn, and a future argument was born. In the spring, as drafts hardened into articles, the German delegation waited. They were kept at arm's length, housed away from the center, treated not as partners in negotiation, but as defendants awaiting sentence. This was partly moral theater and partly strategy. The victors feared that if Germany were allowed to negotiate, Germany would divide them, exploit their differences, and escape constraints. They also feared their own voters, who expected firmness. Yet the method had consequences. A peace delivered as an ultimatum is remembered as an ultimatum. On May 7, 1919, the German delegates were brought to Versailles and presented with the terms. Versailles was chosen for symbolism as much as convenience. In 1871, after Germany's victory over France, the German Empire had been proclaimed in the Hall of Mirrors. Now, in the same place, Germany would be asked to accept defeat. History has a taste for reversals, and statesmen sometimes believe that humiliating symbols can substitute for stable policy. Count Ulrich von Brockdorff-Rantzau, the head of the German delegation, listened as the terms were read and responded with a mixture of defiance and warning. He acknowledged suffering and responsibility, but he rejected the implication of sole guilt. He warned that the terms would impose hardship not only on Germans, but on Europe. His words did not soften the terms. They hardened attitudes. In Paris, many heard in his tone the old German arrogance, refusing to accept reality. In Germany, many heard that the victors intended not peace, but degradation. The German government in Berlin faced a decision that felt like a choice between choking and drowning. If it refused to sign, the Allies threatened to resume hostilities and invade. Germany's army was exhausted, and the blockade still starved the country. If it signed, it would accept terms that many Germans viewed as incompatible with sovereignty. The government was new, democratic, fragile, born out of revolution and defeat. Its opponents were ready to brand it traitorous either way. In June, the National Assembly met in Weimar, far from the street violence of Berlin, to decide. Weimar itself carried symbolism, a refuge of culture amid political collapse. Inside, delegates argued, pleaded, shouted. Some demanded rejection and national resistance. Others pointed to the army's condition, the hunger, the impossibility of fighting on. The threat was not only an Allied invasion, but an internal rupture. Germany's right wing spoke of betrayal. Its left wing threatened revolution. Between them stood a government trying to prevent the state from shattering. The Assembly voted grimly to accept. On June 28, 1919, 5 years to the day after the assassination in Sarajevo that had begun the chain toward war, German representatives signed the treaty at Versailles. Outside, the world heard speeches about a new order. Inside Germany, the treaty was quickly given a name that sounded like a diagnosis: the dictated peace. In Paris, the moment felt like closure. Photographs captured men at tables, pens poised, faces solemn. Yet closure was an illusion. The treaty did not settle Europe's contradictions. It redistributed them. It attempted to build a stable continent while leaving millions of men demobilized, millions of families grieving, economies disordered, and political legitimacy fragile. It created new states that needed protection and new minorities that needed guarantees. It imposed limits on Germany that required enforcement. It promised collective security through a league while simultaneously dividing the great powers over how security would be maintained. It tied reparations to responsibility while leaving the financial machinery of the world in disarray. The treaty's immediate problem was not simply that it was harsh or mild. Its immediate problem was that it was not one policy, but several policies layered together, each one undermining the others. Germany was to be restrained militarily, yet the treaty also expected Germany to pay vast sums. Payment required economic recovery, exports, industrial production, and a functioning financial system. Restraint required limiting Germany's capacity to use force. Recovery required allowing Germany to trade, borrow, and stabilize. The victors wanted Germany weak and solvent at the same time, and they offered no coherent method to achieve both. France was to be protected through demilitarization and occupation, and through the promise of Anglo-American support. Yet that support depended on political approval in parliaments that were already restless. Britain could promise help and later reconsider. America could promise help and then withdraw. A guarantee written in hopeful ink is not the same as a battalion on the Rhine. A League of Nations was to serve as the new moral center, discouraging aggression and resolving disputes. Yet the League's power would depend on the unity of its members, and the members were already divided by fear, interest, and memory. The League was conceived as a remedy for the old balance of power, but it inherited the same need, the willingness of strong states to act together, even when it was inconvenient. The treaty drew borders in the name of peoples, but it could not draw them without leaving millions of people on the wrong side. Those minorities would become internal fault lines. Some would be oppressed, some would be used as excuses for intervention, and many would grow to distrust the very states meant to protect them. Even the economics of the settlement were bound into a larger financial knot. Britain and France owed enormous sums to the United States. Their publics demanded that Germany pay for the war's cost and destruction. Yet Germany could pay only by exporting goods or borrowing money, and those goods would compete with British and French industries, while borrowing would often come from American lenders. The peace thus quietly depended on a flow of American capital into Germany so that Germany could pay Britain and France, so that Britain and France could pay the United States. It was a circular structure built on confidence, and confidence is the first thing that war destroys. The treaty's first years showed how quickly these contradictions could become events. In Berlin, the Weimar Republic began life under a curse. It was blamed for signing. It was forced to enforce terms it had not created. Right-wing veterans and nationalist politicians spoke of the November criminals who had, they claimed, stabbed the army in the back. The myth ignored the military reality of 1918, but myths do not require reality. They require a wound and a storyteller. The Republic tried to build parliamentary habits in a country where authority had long worn a uniform, and it tried to build legitimacy while hunger and unemployment waited outside the doors. In France, the mood hardened. Many Frenchmen looked at the treaty and saw compromise where they had demanded assurance. They saw a demilitarized zone that would eventually be evacuated, and they wondered what would remain when the Allied soldiers left. They saw a Germany that still contained the Ruhr, still contained its population, still contained its industrial heart. They watched German politics churn, and they imagined the return of German force as a matter of time. Britain watched with a different anxiety, that France might act unilaterally, occupying territory, squeezing Germany, provoking a crisis, and dragging Britain into another confrontation. Britain wanted the treaty enforced, but not to the point of economic collapse and political explosion. That line was not easy to draw, and it shifted with every election and every newspaper headline. Meanwhile, in Washington, the treaty faced its own trial. Wilson returned from Paris exhausted and determined, believing that the League of Nations was the essential pillar of the whole settlement. Without it, the treaty would be merely a punitive document, lacking a mechanism for peaceful revision and collective enforcement. Yet the United States Senate, jealous of its constitutional power and suspicious of entangling commitments, did not share his certainty. Henry Cabot Lodge, leading the opposition, did not necessarily oppose international cooperation in principle, but he opposed the idea that America would be bound to act by decisions made elsewhere. The League's covenant included a promise that members would preserve the territorial integrity and political independence of other members against aggression. To Wilson, this was the moral heart. To his opponents, it looked like a blank check. The debate in Washington was not conducted in calm, philosophical terms. It was personal, partisan, and bitter. Wilson refused to accept reservations that would, in his view, gut the League. Lodge insisted on reservations that would preserve American freedom of action. The country, tired of war and suspicious of foreign commitments, leaned toward withdrawal. Wilson, stubborn and ill, took his case to the public, traveling by train and speaking until his body failed. In September 1919, he suffered a severe stroke that left him incapacitated. The presidency became a kind of shadow theater, decisions filtered through a small circle, the nation not fully aware of the extent of the damage. In March 1920, the Senate rejected the treaty. The United States did not join the League. With that rejection, one of the settlement's central supports vanished. France had accepted the League and a demilitarized Rhineland, partly because it believed America would stand behind it. Britain had accepted responsibilities partly because it expected America to share them. Germany had been asked to accept constraints partly in the name of a new global order that would be fair and collective. Now, the largest creditor and the most powerful rising state stepped back, leaving Europe to manage the burdens with less authority, less money, and less unity. In Europe, the enforcement of the treaty became a series of crises, each one deepening mistrust. In 1921, the Reparations Commission, after months of deliberation, fixed a sum and a schedule. The figure was staggering to German ears and to many foreign observers. The Allies insisted it reflected real damage and costs. Germany insisted it was impossible. German governments alternated between pleading, bargaining, delaying, and paying just enough to avoid catastrophe. Each delay convinced French politicians that Germany was cheating. Each French threat convinced Germans that the treaty was designed to crush them. The treaty had created a relationship not of cooperation, but of suspicion, and suspicion is an expensive currency. France, frustrated by what it saw as German obstruction, turned toward direct action. In January 1923, French and Belgian troops marched into the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heart, to seize coal and industrial output as payment. The Ruhr was not a romantic landscape. It was a region of mines, factories, rail yards, smokestacks. Occupation here meant control of production. It was a blunt instrument, chosen because diplomacy had failed. Germany responded with passive resistance. Workers refused to cooperate. The German government paid them to strike. Production fell. The occupiers confiscated goods. Tension rose. Sabotage and arrests followed. The Ruhr occupation created a contest of endurance between states already exhausted. To pay for the resistance, the German government printed money. It was not the first time. War financing had already weakened German currency. Now the printing presses accelerated into madness. Prices began to climb, then to leap, then to detach from ordinary comprehension. A loaf of bread became a daily calculation. Salaries were paid twice a day so workers could spend before money lost value. Housewives carried baskets of notes. Children played with bundles of paper that had once represented savings. Middle-class families watched a lifetime of prudence evaporate. The state's legitimacy, already thin, became translucent. Hyperinflation did not occur solely because of reparations and occupation. It grew from the broader post-war disorder, from the collapse of old fiscal discipline, from political instability, from the wounds of war. But the occupation and reparations struggle provided the spark and the fuel. It turned a financial problem into a social trauma, and trauma seeks an enemy. In German politics, the treaty became that enemy, and the Republic became the accomplice. In France, the Ruhr action did not bring the satisfaction promised. It brought coal and some payments, but it also brought international criticism, strained relations with Britain, and the recognition that forcing a defeated country to pay by occupation could destroy the very economy from which payment would come. Britain, watching the chaos, pressed for a new approach. The United States, outside the treaty but deeply involved as creditor and lender, watched with alarm. American banks had begun to lend money to Germany, and they now feared instability that could disrupt repayment and markets. The crisis produced a new compromise in 1924, the Dawes Plan. It restructured reparations payments, stabilized the German currency, and arranged loans, largely from American sources, to help Germany meet obligations. For a moment, Europe seemed to breathe again. Germany stabilized, industry recovered. Cultural life in Berlin and other cities brightened into a brief, glittering interlude. Diplomats spoke of reconciliation. The treaty, harsh in its original form, was being softened by practical necessity. Yet this softening carried its own poison. It confirmed to many Germans that the treaty was not a fixed moral settlement, but a negotiable imposition, to be revised by pressure and crisis. It confirmed to many Frenchmen that only force and threat produced results. It confirmed to Britain that continental stability required economic pragmatism rather than punitive righteousness. And it confirmed to the world that the peace depended on American money even while America refused political responsibility. The arrangement was not stable. It was a truce in the financial war. In 1925, at Locarno in Switzerland, European leaders signed agreements that seemed to mark a turning. Germany, under Gustav Stresemann, accepted its western borders with France and Belgium, and Britain and Italy guaranteed those borders. Germany was admitted to the League the following year. The speeches spoke of a new spirit. Photographs showed handshakes and smiles. Some called it the dawn of a safer Europe. But Locarno contained a quiet asymmetry. The western borders were guaranteed. The eastern borders were not guaranteed in the same way. Poland and Czechoslovakia listened carefully and heard that their security depended more on geography and alliances than on collective promises. Germany, meanwhile, could present Locarno as proof that revision through diplomacy was possible. The treaty's legitimacy was being altered not by universal acceptance, but by selective adjustment. Even in these calmer years, the deeper contradictions remained. France still feared Germany's potential. Germany still resented constraints and losses. The new states in the East still contained minorities and disputes. Italy still felt that the spoils of victory did not match its sacrifice, and its politics drifted toward authoritarian nationalism under Benito Mussolini. In Russia, the Bolshevik regime consolidated power and watched Europe with suspicion, excluded and feared. The peace had not created a community. It had created a configuration of states, each with its own hunger. The treaty's failures were not only European. Outside Europe, the peace settlement rearranged empires while speaking of liberation. Germany's colonies were taken, but they were not granted independence. They were assigned as mandates to Britain, France, Japan, and others, under the idea that advanced nations would govern them in trust for the benefit of their peoples. The language was lofty. The reality looked familiar to colonized eyes. Foreign administrators, foreign prophets, foreign flags. In the Middle East, promises made during the war collided. Arabs who had fought against Ottoman rule expected independence. European powers created mandates and borders that served strategic needs, not local cohesion. The map of the region began to take its modern shape under foreign hands, and the resentment began to take its modern tone. In Asia, Japan, having fought on the Allied side, sought recognition of racial equality in the League's covenant and greater security for its gains. The racial equality proposal was rejected, a decision that carried symbolic weight far beyond the conference hall. It signaled that the New World Order would not be truly universal in its moral claims. Japan left Paris with territory and also with a grievance. Grievances are seeds that require time. These global elements were part of the same poisoned peace. The settlement proclaimed a new morality while preserving old hierarchies. It promised openness while protecting imperial interests. It spoke of peoples while negotiating in the language of great powers. This mismatch did not directly cause the next European war, but it weakened the moral credibility of the new system and widened the field in which revisionist ambitions could grow. By the late 1920s, Europe's stability looked more convincing than it was. German payments continued under revised plans. American money flowed, cities rebuilt, trade resumed. Yet the entire structure rested on assumptions that could be shattered by a loss of confidence. It depended on the willingness of lenders to lend, on the ability of Germany to export, on the political strength of moderate governments, and on the continuing belief that the post-war order would endure. Any one of these could fail. In 1929, several failed together. The Great Depression did not originate in Versailles, but Versailles had built a financial architecture that made Europe vulnerable to American shocks. When American credit contracted, German banks and businesses were hit hard. Loans were called in. Unemployment surged. The German government faced impossible choices: cut spending and deepen misery, or spend and risk financial collapse. Social pain returned with a vengeance, and political extremism thrives on pain. The Weimar Republic had been built on compromise and parliamentary coalition. It now faced a public that no longer trusted compromise. The middle class, already scarred by hyperinflation, feared ruin again. Workers, unemployed, felt abandoned. Farmers struggled. In this environment, parties that promised simple answers gained strength. Among them were the National Socialists, who offered not only economic promises, but a story of national humiliation and revenge. They spoke of betrayal in 1918 and humiliation in 1919. They spoke of lost territories, disarmed pride, foreign occupation, and the shame of responsibility. They did not need to persuade Germans that the treaty was unjust. Many already believed it. They needed only to persuade them that rage could be harnessed into power. When Adolf Hitler became Chancellor in January 1933, it was not because a treaty clause appointed him. It was because a society fractured by defeat, disorder, and economic catastrophe turned toward a movement that promised restoration. Yet the treaty was a constant instrument in that movement's hands. It was the symbol that could unite disparate resentments. It transformed complex problems into a single narrative. Germany had been wronged, and Germany would rise again. The victors watched this with a mixture of dread and paralysis. France, still haunted, sought security through alliances with the eastern states and through reliance on the League. Britain, increasingly concerned about economic recovery and wary of war, leaned toward negotiation and revision. The United States remained distant. The League, without America, and without the full commitment of Britain and France to act together decisively, was exposed. The early challenges to the post-war system revealed its weakness. Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, creating a puppet state. The League condemned but could not compel. Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935. The League imposed sanctions that were partial and inconsistent, and they failed. Each failure taught a lesson to aggressors. The new order spoke loudly and acted softly. In Europe itself, Germany began to peel away the treaty's constraints in a careful sequence. Rearmament proceeded first in secrecy and then openly. Conscription returned. The Air Force was built. These were violations of the treaty, but responses were hesitant. Many in Britain believed that some revision was reasonable, that Germany had been treated too harshly, and that allowing Germany some restoration might stabilize Europe. Many in France believed the opposite, that any concession fed appetite. Yet France's political divisions and demographic reality made unilateral war unthinkable without allies, and allies were uncertain. In March 1936, German troops marched into the Rhineland, the region that the treaty had demilitarized. The move was militarily risky for Germany at the time. French forces could have responded and potentially forced a retreat. German generals later acknowledged that they were not prepared for a full confrontation. It was a gamble, and gambles reveal the character of those watching. In Berlin, the decision was framed as a restoration of sovereignty. German soldiers crossed bridges and entered towns that were German by language and sentiment, yet forbidden to their army by treaty. The symbolism was immense. Hitler presented it as an end to humiliation. Crowds cheered. The regime gained legitimacy. In Paris, alarm rang like a bell inside a cracked church. French leaders knew what the Rhineland represented. It was the buffer that gave France time. It was the zone that made a surprise German attack harder. Its demilitarization was not a moral gesture, it was a hinge of French security. Yet France hesitated. Mobilization was politically difficult, and acting alone carried the risk of being blamed for starting a war. Britain signaled caution and urged negotiation. The League, again, could condemn but could not compel action without the commitment of its strongest members. The moment passed. Germany held the Rhineland. The treaty's enforcement, which had depended on unity and resolve, was exposed as conditional. A clause without enforcement is a suggestion, and suggestions do not restrain states that have chosen to risk everything. After the Rhineland, the pace of revision accelerated. Germany and Italy drew closer. The Spanish Civil War became a rehearsal and a warning. German arms grew. The new states in the East, created and protected in theory by the post-war order, began to look like isolated outposts. Austria was absorbed into Germany in 1938. The Sudetenland crisis followed, driven by the presence of German speakers within Czechoslovakia's borders, a minority created not by malice, but by the impossibility of drawing perfect lines. Hitler demanded their incorporation. Britain and France, desperate to avoid war and convinced that grievance could be satisfied by concession, met in Munich and agreed to the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia without its meaningful participation. The language was peace. The result was the destruction of trust and the confirmation that treaties could be revised by threat. From the viewpoint of 1919, these later events can look inevitable, as if the peace carried a curse that had to unfold. It was not inevitable. Different choices could have produced different outcomes. Yet the peace was indeed poisoned in the sense that it had embedded within itself the conditions that made catastrophe more likely. It had imposed obligations on Germany without a path that Germans could accept as legitimate. It had demanded payment while destabilizing the economy needed to pay. It had constrained German power without creating a stable system of enforcement to uphold those constraints. It had offered France promises that depended on foreign political will, and foreign political will proved unreliable. It had created new states and borders that solved old imperial problems but produced new minority and security problems. It had proclaimed a new world order while preserving old imperial habits, weakening the credibility of the moral language that was supposed to bind nations together. And it had relied, in the end, on American power and money, while America refused to bind itself to the responsibilities that power implied. The peace failed not because it was too harsh alone or too soft alone, but because it was a compromise between incompatible aims, and the compromise was not backed by a stable coalition willing to bear its cost over time. In 1919, the victors attempted to do three things at once: punish, deter, and reconcile. Punishment demands humiliation and extraction. Deterrence demands credible force and readiness. Reconciliation demands inclusion and dignity. Any one of these can be pursued with consistency. Pursuing all three together requires exceptional political unity and patience. Europe did not have that unity. It did not have that patience. It barely had the strength to feed itself. In September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, the chain snapped in a place that the treaty had left vulnerable. Britain and France declared war. Europe entered another conflict even more total than the first. The promise of 1919 that the world had learned enough from the Great War to prevent a second collapsed into gunfire, mobilization, and darkness. The tragedy is not only that the peace did not hold. The tragedy is that it held just long enough to convince many that it might, and then failed at the moment when the forces it had tried to manage had grown stronger. By the time the settlement's weaknesses were fully visible, the men most willing to exploit them were already in motion. The treaty had tried to end an age of power politics by writing a new morality into international life. It succeeded in writing the morality. It failed in building the conditions that would make that morality enforceable. In the winter of 1919, Paris glittered with lights and uniforms and talk of new beginnings. Beneath the glitter lay a continent that had not yet recovered from the shock of modern war, and a settlement that asked exhausted societies to do what exhaustion makes hardest: to act with discipline, foresight, and restraint for years after the guns fell silent. The guns were silent. The poison worked more slowly.